So now what we'd like to do is turn our attention to some application examples of synthetic language. And so far I've reasonably avoided the discussion of actually what is in a synthetic language. But hopefully now what you'll begin to see is that it's created, it's constructed using this idea that says there are basic building blocks of language, letters, words, and so on. And so in the last few sections of what I've been discussing, I've built up this foundational aspect of really what constructive aspects there are to use to develop our synthetic language building blocks. What we'll talk about now will hopefully make these aspects a little bit clearer. So I'll go through a few examples. In the first example that we'll consider, the idea is to say that, well, given that we know we'd like to perhaps extract information that doesn't exist in the spoken form, is there information we could extract in terms of behavior, social behavior, using perhaps lower level modalities? In terms of speech recognition and in speech signals, what we're looking at here is not actually constructing a model of the entire automatic speech recognition process. We're really just coming back and saying, is it possible to extract out something useful based on this low-level speech modalities? And these could include, for example, utterance length, pause length, phonemes, and so on. And instead of 50,000 words in a symbol set, we're now perhaps talking about 5, 10, 40, or something quite small. So what we're showing here are the results of one particular piece of work where the input is raw speech signals. Now the speech itself was symbolized to obtain the pause length, and then those pause lengths were used in terms of symbols to an entropy-based model. So the middle figure here shows the graphical representation of the pauses, and the data that we're talking about, the data that we used in this was particularly interesting because what we had available was a set of data that has a group of patients that had been previously diagnosed with dementia and a control group of ones that didn't. And so with that, we're able then to feed the raw audio, which was actually very poor quality of conversations between carers interacting with patients, feed that through this model, and then see what it's possible to produce. And the results of this are actually discussed in more detail in a paper that I can point you to. But the particularly interesting thing that we found was that after only about 10 minutes of real-time audio, it's clear that the patients with dementia can be readily identified. Okay. In this next example, we've actually discussed this previously, so I won't go through this in detail, other than to point out that this is one approach of a number that we performed. So using various types of low-level information, we're actually able to obtain some very interesting results. In this case, we could identify the authorship of particular texts. In another case, we were actually able to identify the nationality of different speakers. And so, for example, we can identify the type of language that they were using based on those particular pronunciations. So they were some interesting projects that was early on in the piece, and also a result of some student work that we had as well. Now, the next example that we might consider is this idea of swarm behavior. So in this case, you can probably start to see that the idea of symbolization isn't really too difficult. We just simply think, okay, what are the behaviors that might perhaps characterize what we're looking at? And then we just start to then apply an algorithm to symbolize those. So for example, we could use the multidimensional velocity, the velocity duration. We could then also look at the topology, velocity, and duration. The issue here is quite interesting because it doesn't require us to perform precise measurements of everything. It really just requires us to find a way that simply says, this is how we'll treat the input space. We'll feed that into the model, and then we'll start to then process it and then see what the actual language of those particular types of input symbols start to tell us. And in a way, this is really not unlike what we find in human language, where we might start to see that, in fact, there is a way to view languages as being individual, unique, and yet at the same time, we understand that there's not necessarily a correct language. And the same way here, what we're really saying is that there's not necessarily a correct way or an optimal way that we need to partition the input space. Okay, once we've looked at that, we might then start to think about perhaps there's ways to introduce monitoring of the types of structure and then begin to think about the flow of the behavioural movements and then even look at issues of conversation. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. One of the points that's important to recognise, however, is that in these areas, what we're noticing is that there's actually a requirement for high resolution, real-time spatial data, wherever that space may be. So the types of data that we're beginning to need and to require in this particular area actually is rather different from what's been typically gathered in the past. Okay, so the next area that I'd like to talk about is the analysis of a biological agent. And in terms of the movement of this agent, I'll explain exactly what we're monitoring and looking at a little bit later. I'll go through and show you the results first, which I think perhaps will be the most interesting. So as a precursor to this, let me just put up a typical speech signal again. This is typically a typical speech signal recorded over a few seconds, and to someone familiar with these types of signals, we understand that the meaning behind it actually may be rather hidden from just observing what we see here. This could be somebody coughing, it could be an engine puffing, it could be the words to be or not to be. We don't necessarily know. However, what we see here on the left-hand side is some raw sensor data. Now, here we see on the right the entropy of the data. How then can we make sense of this? We can see that there's some structure, perhaps there's something seemingly of interest that's occurring within the data itself. So what we did next was we applied the CDF-ZML symbolization algorithm to the input data, and this converts the input into a stream of symbols which I've shown here. I've color highlighted each of these so-called words, and yet it's a little tricky to see exactly what this might be indicating. So let me take you through what we did next. Looking at this stream of symbols, what are we to make of it? Is it just random, or is there something meaningful going on here? So to begin to address this, the first question we sought to answer was whether there's any probabilistic structure emerging from it. So to address that particular question, we took the ranked probabilities of all the symbolic words, and we then computed the top 6 of these and then estimated the probabilities according to a Zipf-Mandelbrot-Lee distribution. So it's immediately evident that there is some reasonable degree of similarity between these two distributions, and this perhaps gives us an indication that there's something going on here. Okay, so what we did next was we said, okay, this probabilistic structure indicates there's something happening. What could that be? What we did was we took a large corpora of English novels. So we stepped away from this problem. We took a large database and then performed a statistical analysis on that with the idea of extracting the parts of speech. So we identified the parts of speech and then computed the probabilistic ranking of these. So in this graph here, on the right, you can see the rank ordered probabilities from the top 6 parts of speech. And in the table on the left, you'll see what those parts of speech are. So the most common is a noun, followed by a pronoun, and so on. Okay. What we did next was to match those synthetic words that we had extracted with these parts of speech which have the closest ranked matched probability. So hence the word AB corresponds to a noun, the BCD indicates perhaps a pronoun, and so on. Okay, what we did next was actually to try something a little different. So we introduced a particular instance of parts of speech that corresponds to each of those ones identified. So since a proper noun indicates the name of a place or a thing, we replaced each occurrence with a nominated proper noun. So we chose Joe. And then we replaced each of the other parts of speech in a similar way with common nouns, verbs, and so on. And then when we did this, the results were actually rather surprising. This is what we saw. What we see here is really something quite interesting. This is synthetic language that has been extracted from the raw sensory data. And although I can admit that it doesn't really seem to be perhaps the best grammar that I've ever seen, I get the picture of what they're trying to say. So to me, this is really, really quite interesting and perhaps even just a little bit amazing at the same time. Okay, what this actually was derived from was a Kalahari meerkat. So it's entirely non-vocal, and what we see here though is that there's actually a clear structure which starts to make sense. Immediately prior to this there was a long period of silence, and then we see this particular event occurring where there's something of interest, there's excitement. We can see this structure beginning to emerge in the language. So what's interesting is that we see some of these synthetic words which begin to emerge naturally. And so another interesting aspect, in contrast to normal speech where we've got pauses which are silent, in this case the silence is not necessarily completely stopping. A meerkat may not stop moving, and so in 3D space what we observed was that the pauses are not necessarily given by no movement, but actually they're given by these small movements in north, south, east, west, or up, down directions. And so it appears overall that there's this definite pattern of emergent synthetic words coming from the behavioural characteristics of the meerkat. So these are just some of the preliminary results, and there's still a lot to be done. This was actually work based on data collected by Chakravarti and his colleagues at the École Polytechnique Institute in Switzerland, and the results were published in 2019 in Movement Ecology. Okay, so we're not quite done. Let's take this a little bit further. Let's go back and re-examine the movement of swarms. So just to stress that this is now looking at future work. Based on the previous section where we are able to identify the potential language of particular entities, now the next step is to consider perhaps synthetic conversations. So this would correspond to the behavioural movements, for example, between multiple swarms. And while at first this might seem more complex, in fact it actually may provide a means of self-verification. So let's consider a simple example. Suppose swarm A says, "Look at this." If swarm B doesn't respond, then we can begin to discount what we see swarm A saying. But if swarm B responds in a particular way, then we might actually start to build a model that says, this is actually what swarm A has said and there's some support for it. Okay, as we continue to model these conversations, the next aspect really is that we can build up a swarm language. We can then start modeling the entropy or surprise of synthetic conversations to identify particular areas of significance, perhaps surprising aspects of the conversation. This could be then passed to higher level agents. And in all of this, what you can start to see is that there's the potential for moving from synthetic words to synthetic sentences of language. And then ultimately, at least in the next level, there's this idea of synthetic narratives and themes that may emerge as well. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about this further. Thanks very much.